Hello and welcome to today's webinar. The topic is Insight and Evaluation for Reading Issues like Dyslexia. And hosting our webinar today is Dr. Paul Yellin. He is the director of the Yellin Center for Mind, Brain, and Education. He is also an associate professor of pediatrics at the New York University School of Medicine. Hi Paul, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Good morning. How are you today?
Well, I'm very excited to learn about evaluation specifically for kids with reading issues, so take it away.
Excellent. Well, it's a real pleasure for me to be here. I'm so pleased with the work that Understood does, and so being part of this is really a true pleasure. We at the Yellin Center are involved in evaluations and also do a lot of follow-up care with children and work with schools, so it's really our pleasure to share with you a little bit about these issues. So we can start whenever we're ready.
Great. I want to mention one thing, which is that we're going to go through Dr. Yellin's presentation, and then at the end there will be time for questions from viewers. So if you want to type in a question into the chat box, we'll be getting to those after we get through the presentation.
Excellent. So what I thought I would do is just take us through a bit about the kinds of, well, just a couple of kids, a couple of children that might start the conversation about an evaluation. So if we could have the first, as parents, we're thinking, well, Mark is somebody who's having a lot of trouble learning to read and to spell. And I just want to show you, so move to the next slide, please. And well, what we know about the reading process is, at least a piece of the reading process, has to do with something called phonological processing and phonics, which is to say, if I were to say the word cat to you, you'd have a picture in your brain of exactly what I'm talking about. But learning to read the word involves a lot of other things, one of which is being able to understand that words are made up of different sounds, and not just letters, but sounds. That's called phonemes. So the word cat has a k, a at, and a t sound. And children need to be able to hear those sounds and tell them apart. And then something called phonological processing is moving those sounds around so that I can take the k, at, t in cat and make it into tack or act, depending on what I do with those sounds. Or I can take cat and take the k away and put an h there and make it, or a hook sound and make it at. So that's phonological processing. And now children need to connect those sounds with letters when they read, which is called phonics. And I just wanted to show you one piece of the reading process, and let's look at some of Mark's work. And if we look at what Mark has written here, we can see, I'm just going to read the first line because the ideas across the work are similar, which is Mark is trying to say that Tom was riding his bike, but he spells riding R-A-N-D-I-N-G. And we look and say, well, wait a second, that says randing. So what does that tell us? And let's go to the next. So hold that thought and let's look at Mark's spelling. And he's spelling words in ways where the letters and the sounds he's trying to show you don't line up together. So that's an example of looking at somebody and saying, well, Mark is not understanding how letters and sounds work, really. And so in Mark's spelling and in his writing, we're getting some clues about some critical pieces of the reading process. I want to show you another slide. So this is Mark's math homework. And if we just look at how he does on this math problem, the correct answer, by the way, I think is supposed to be 22, but he gets 198. And so if you just looked at this, you'd say, well, he got the wrong answer. But if you take a look more closely, you realize that, well, in the question or in the math problem, there are two numbers. There's 3 and 66. And what you're supposed to do is, what this problem calls for is doing division, dividing 66 by 3. What Mark does is he multiplies that. And so as we look at it, we can say, well, wait a second. He did the math well. He multiplied perfectly well. He just didn't know he wasn't supposed to multiply. And so it looks like a math problem, but Mark is having trouble reading. And having trouble reading he didn't know what he was supposed to do. He kind of ignored the words and took those numbers and figured that you can either add them, subtract them, multiply them, or divide them, and he guessed wrong, and he multiplied them. Had he guessed right and gotten the wrong answer, if he guessed wrong or he guessed right and gotten the right answer, we would have thought, oh, he knows his math. But here's an example of somebody who's having trouble with math, but the problem is really a reading problem.
Let me pause you for just 1 second, Paul, which is, for this example of Mark, this child Mark, can you give us a rough idea of how old this child is? I would guess maybe 5th grade from looking at these.
Yes. So let's say Mark is in sort of middle elementary school grades, and that's a really important question to look at. And these things will make a difference depending on how old the child is. But these are the kinds of things that are sort of getting us thinking and saying, well, wait a second, there's a problem here. And oftentimes, in the kind of mistakes a child is making are a lot of clues about what the problem might be.
And these clues are things that a parent, while looking at Mark's homework, might just start to maybe take some notes and go to the school, and this is maybe what leads up to a request for an evaluation?
That's right. And so that these are the kinds of things that might lead up to the request for an evaluation, but it might also give you some clues, and hopefully the teacher some clues on looking at his work every day to say what's going on.
Okay,
and
great.
So let's move to really the heart of the matter. Well, what is an evaluation? And really, it's a process for understanding your child with particular focus on learning needs. It typically involves a number of different specialists focusing on different parts of the learning process, and typically it involves a number of different sources of information, usually formal testing, might be informal assessment, which we just did now. So that would be called an error analysis, where he didn't sit down and take a test, but we looked and said, oh, his work sample told us a bit about how he is working, and it gives us a clue about where the problem might be, as well as observations and interviews and other parts of his schoolwork or the child's schoolwork. And that it's important to know that you have a right to seek an evaluation at any time. They're really, and we hear parents a lot of the time sort of say to the teacher, I think there's a problem, and the teacher will say, no, I don't think so. If you really believe there's a problem, you have a right to ask the school to perform an assessment. And in fact, public schools have what's called child find, which is a legal responsibility to find children with disabilities such as learning needs, learning issues. They need to assess a child in every area of suspected need. They must look for all of the potential problems so that if you are concerned and your child has a reading issue like Mark does, they need to look at how he reads. And they can't just do an assessment. And if you're concerned about his writing as well, or you're concerned about his math as well, they need to assess all of those areas. And you also should know that even if your child attends a private school, you're entitled to an evaluation through the local public school district. Typically, we know in New York State, for example, it's the district where your child goes to school, but that might vary state by state.
Great, and I just want to mention for the people watching, we're going to be sharing some content. Understood has some content that helps explain how you request an evaluation, who qualifies for evaluation, how schools decide those things, the difference between getting a school-based evaluation and a private evaluation. So we have a lot of great content on the site, but we'll be sharing that, and also we can get to your questions a little bit later on in the webinar. But we're really glad that people joined us this morning, and they're very interested in this topic.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about the differences between a private and a school-based evaluation. But I think that, and I would absolutely refer to the Understood website, because you want to make these requests in writing, and that there's a requirement of your school to respond within a certain amount of time. Now, typically in a school evaluation, there'll be different pieces to it, but typically they'll do psychological or cognitive testing, which we call IQ, educational or achievement testing, and then other areas that will be driven by where the problems might be. So a speech and language assessment or an occupational therapy assessment, sometimes social work, or looking at behavioral concerns. But all the areas of concern need to be looked at. Next, please. Now, what are the goals of an evaluation? And I think it's important to bear in mind that your goals and the school's goals may not be the same. Your goal is really very clear. You want to understand the problem in the context of all of your child's needs. What does this mean? And what are your options in terms of what should be done about it? Your goal really is to do what's optimal for your child. Schools' goals are typically different. Their goal is to determine what services you're eligible for, and generally to identify specific services that they're mandated to provide and to provide appropriate care. Now, appropriate care is a different standard, obviously, and it's different than optimal care. Now, and just one other thing I want to talk about in this is it's important to know, though, that appropriate care is appropriate care. And what I mean by that is that it can't be that the school says, well, we either give option A or option B, and if appropriate care is C, they can't say that you need to choose between A or B. You're entitled to C. Next slide, please. Okay, now, there's an alphabet soup in this that can be extremely overwhelming, and Understood does a nice job of laying these out. I'm just going to take you through some of them quickly to just give you an overview. So IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Now, it is a federal law, and so it is not something that your district can say, well, we don't follow it. It's a federal law that mandates certain things, and if a child has one of 13 different disabilities, they're entitled to services under this law. And in essence, the evaluation is looking to see whether your child qualifies for services under this law. And if your child does, what you're entitled to are certain things. One is called FAPE, or Free Appropriate Public Education. And appropriate, as some people have said to me, if you're entitled to a car, it doesn't need to be a Lexus, but it needs to be a car. And needs to have all the parts of a car. Least restrictive environment is an important concept. When I was growing up 100 years ago, kids that got special ed were in a room down the hall where you never saw them. You need to understand special ed is not a place. It's a range of services. And that what the law says is that your child needs to be educated in what's called the least restrictive environment, meaning as close to a mainstream classroom as possible. So if your child can receive services just through the regular curriculum, then the school needs to do that. Less restrictive, more restrictive would be having somebody pushed in to give services. More restrictive would be getting pulled out for services. And most restrictive in a school might be in a self-contained classroom. But the school has a burden to have your child educated in the least restrictive environment. And then IEP is the individualized educational program. And once again, it needs to be individualized. They can't say, this is the menu of services we offer and choose this. It needs to be individualized. The last concept is IEE, which is an independent educational evaluation, which is the kind of work we do here. Lots of places do. Typically, an independent educational evaluation has standing in that the school needs to consider its findings. Sometimes your school district will pay for one, although that's, in my experience, not so common, but it's something to look for. Next slide, please.
Paul, let me jump in for one sec, which is I love that you titled that slide Alphabet Soup, because it can be really hard to keep track of all those different acronyms, and it can be sometimes feel a little bit overwhelming, especially if you're at a meeting and people are throwing around these acronyms. And I wanted to mention to the folks watching that Understood has a lot of articles that help break down not only what the different laws are, but different very practical bite-sized bits of information on how to help advocate, how to make sure that your child's rights, it's help you know what your child's rights are and help you advocate for your child. And so there's a section on Understood that's all about your child's rights. So it really walks through everything you're just mentioning, FAPE, least restrictive environment, all these sort of legal terms. But we have a ton of that, and I just wanted to place that in context here for today's webinar, which is getting an evaluation is what determines whether your child qualifies for these legal protection. So this is getting an evaluation sort of opens the door.
And we're gonna touch on a lot of that. So
Great.
absolutely. Okay. So hopefully, I think that you'll have a sense of what questions might be open as you see what we talk about. Because I think we're going to cover some of that, but I think the website is a great resource. So once again, what are the school's questions? And schools, we do a lot of professional development with different schools, and what different schools do is, there are always letter of the law schools and schools that go beyond it. But the bottom line is that schools quite often and typically are looking to ask the question, is there a problem? Does the problem fall into one of the 13 disability categories covered by the IDEA, by this law? Is the problem severe enough to require special educational services? So it isn't simply that there is a problem, but that the problem needs to require services, and if so, what services are going to be required? And that's the core purpose of the evaluation from the school's perspective. Next slide, please. Okay, so what happens next? We talked about the different individuals in the team that might be assessing your child, and that assessment needs to involve every area of suspected disability, and typically each person who works with your child will write a report describing what they learned about your child. Now, you have a right to have those results explained to you. You have a right to have your questions answered, and you do have the right to question or disagree with the findings or conclusions. Next slide, please. Then typically, the results are brought to an IEP team meeting for review. The team has different names in different schools, maybe Committee for Special Education, IEP team, or committee. You need to know a couple of things. One is, as a parent, you are a member of that IEP team and you have the right to participate fully, receive copies of all relevant documents at no cost, and invite someone who can provide support, such as a friend or advocate. If you've had an independent evaluation, you can have that evaluator participate in the meeting. You can have counsel participate in the meeting, although I would generally advise against that. But we participate in those meetings a great deal, and it's important for you to know that you really are a member of that meeting. And what that means is that it's not okay for the school to come in with their IEP already written and hand it to you and say, okay, you have to sign it. So that you do have input into what the IEP looks like, and you don't have to sign it at that meeting. You have time to review it, and you have time to deliberate and get some advice about whether what's in it is appropriate for your child. Next, please. So once again, the IEP team is focusing on two major questions. Is your child eligible for services under IDEA? Does your child meet the criteria for one of the 13 disabilities? And as a result of the disability, does your child need special education services? And then quite often, at that meeting, once eligibility is determined, the next step is to develop the individualized educational plan or program. Next, please. Now, the IEP needs to address a certain number of things. It needs to address the underlying problem. It needs to involve specific evidence-based interventions. And, a lot of IEPs will say your child's going to resource room 5 days a week. And to me, that's like saying you're going to go to the operating room. Well, that's fine, but you want to know what's happening when you go there. And so it's important to ask, what are they going to be doing in resource room? For a reading disability, is it Orton Gillingham instruction? Is it Wilson? Is it every day? Is it going to be a group 1-to-1 or 6-to-1? What are the other instructional strategies that are going to be in place? And how are they going to assess progress? It needs to also provide reasonable access to the curriculum. Let's say Mark is in the 5th grade and he's reading at a low level because of his problems with sounding out words. But Mark can understand spoken language at above grade level. Well, then he may need audiobooks so he can get the access to the material that he's hearing, so that when he goes to social studies, he can't read the social studies book because he's working on his reading skills. He's entitled to audiobooks that allow him to access the content. He's also entitled to testing accommodations. Maybe he needs the questions read aloud, because if he has to read those questions himself, it's not going to reflect, he's not going to be able to give you an answer that shows you what he knows. And once again, he may need some bypass strategies. If he's having difficulty writing, he might need a scribe to take his notes. The point is that the IEP needs to be specific, and it needs to include measurable outcomes, and it's important to push for those things at the meeting. Next, please. Now, there's important limitations that we have to talk about. Number one is, no matter how well-meaning your school is, there's an inherent conflict of interest. The school is basically concerned with allocating scarce resources among lots of children. You're concerned with making sure your child's needs are met, and those two things may not be the same. The primary goal for the school is to determine eligibility for service, and that might mean that they may not go deep enough to uncover the underlying cause of the problem. They also may not look for areas of strength, which are critical. Their focus is in oftentimes in this narrow place. Next, please. So when might you seek an independent or private evaluation? Well, two main areas. One is as an alternative to a school evaluation. Second is for a second opinion if you disagree with the school, either because you don't believe that the evaluation accurately portrayed your child's abilities and needs, that they didn't get to the root cause of the problem, or that they did not find your child eligible for services and you believe that your child should be, that the IEP itself is not sufficient and is not addressing your child's needs sufficiently, or there's an IEP in place and they're not complying with that IEP. Next. So one of the advantages of a private evaluation is that there's no conflict of interest. The evaluator's role is solely to you and to your child. Typically, they have access to a wider range of evaluation tools and can focus in on something that we think is really important, which is a term for medicine called differential diagnosis. That's to say that if you go into your, quite often an IEP might come up with the diagnosis of a reading disorder. And what I hope to show you with Mark is, well, reading disorders can have different causes to them. And so think about, in terms of a differential diagnosis term comes from medicine, which is to say, if you go to your doctor and say, I have a cough, your doctor doesn't say, and you say to your doctor, what do you do for a cough? Your doctor goes through a process of figuring out why do you have a cough, because it makes a huge difference whether you swallowed chicken bone or whether you have pneumonia or whether you have a bad cold. Whereas a lot of school-based assessments will come up with the answer that your child has a reading disorder. Well, the underlying cause of the reading disorder is going to affect what you do about it. They also, a private evaluation has the ability to take a more comprehensive view of your child's needs beyond eligibility for services. And so that they quite often are going to look at your child's strengths. And what we know about an assessment and what we know about helping children become successful in life is that they need to focus on their strengths as much as their challenges. I was speaking to a tennis coach, and she was saying to me, for example, Rafael Nadal has for those of you who don't know, he's a tennis player who at one time was number one in the world. And she said, you may not know this, but people who know tennis well says that Rafael has a bad or a weak backhand. And so what she said to me was, well, if you said to Rafael Nadal, you have a backhand disability and you better work on your backhand all the time, he wouldn't be a champion. He needed to know that the other parts of his game were strong. And she said to me that you might not believe this, but when Rafael Nadal plays tennis, when seasoned tennis watchers watch him, he hits 80% fewer backhands than other tennis players. So he understands his challenge, and he doesn't focus just on his challenge. His success is built around his strengths. And so an evaluation needs to look at those things, and that may not be something that is surfaced in an assessment that is looking solely to determine whether a child's eligible for services. They also may be able to provide a more comprehensive view of your child's needs besides eligibility for services, because they may be able to, oftentimes they're able to stay more up to date on things that might be available out in the community that the school may not have. You also have the right to decide what you want to share with the school, and an independent evaluator can participate in that IEP team meeting to advocate for what your child needs. Next. Of course, there's disadvantages. They're expensive. They typically involve some disruption of routine, typically not unusual to have to miss some school time. And of course, you want to balance the benefit to the risk, but that's something to keep in mind. And while schools must consider the results and recommendations, there is no guarantee that they will. And so that you need to know that. Next, please. Also should know that there is a middle ground, that most people who will do assessments will also do consultations. And that is oftentimes a useful option because they can provide useful information even if you plan to have a school do the evaluation. Before the school evaluation, they may help you begin to advocate and so that you understand what you need to insist on to ensure that your child is getting the right assessment, or after the evaluation to review the findings and recommendations. Because if you feel, and you may feel that, well, your school is doing a great job and your child's getting everything that you need, and so that there's no need to seek a private consultation. Next, please. What we would look for, though, in a comprehensive evaluation or any evaluation is to begin to link what's going on as a problem with where the underlying cause of the problem is. So for Mark, his spelling and decoding problem had to do with his difficulty managing the sounds in words. So he had weak phonological processing. And so we would say that an effective evaluation for Mark needs to not just say that he has a reading disorder, but has to make sure that it generates an IEP that has tools in place that are going to work on decoding and spelling problems. Next. And to bear in mind that regardless of where your child gets assessed, you want to not lose sight of your child's strengths. Those are going to be critically important. Mark has an excellent grasp of verbal concepts. When you speak to him, he's incredibly insightful. While he has trouble reading and has difficulty with the sound parts of words, he understands when you read to him, and he understands when you speak to him. So an important part of the evaluation isn't just to figure out where the problem is, but also to figure out where the problem is not. And we also think that it's really important to talk to a child about these things. Tell a child, see, when we read to you, Mark, you're understanding above grade level text, so that your brain is really working really well in understanding those parts of language, and you have a great long-term memory. And so we think it's critically important, not just to figure out where the problem is, and not just to figure out where the strengths are, but to talk to your child about those strengths and challenges, and to delineate them, because it's important, which we typically find even with kids with significant learning disabilities, they have way more strengths than they have challenges. And showing them where those strengths are can be incredibly empowering. And it's a lot easier to work on something that's challenging if you realize, well, it isn't all that I am. I have all of these strengths. And so it's important to also understand that I have all these strengths, but what I'm working on has a name. And it's got boundaries around it. It's called phonological processing. Even if kids don't quite understand exactly what that means, it's important to talk about it so we can say to Mark, you're having trouble reading because you're having trouble with phonological processing, and now this is why you're working with somebody 5 days a week, and we're going to strengthen that muscle. Just like when you go to play softball and your coach has you practice on your hitting skills, because that's an important part of the baseball game, we're working on your phonics skills. Next, please. So, key is a difference between evaluating to determine eligibility and evaluating to understand. And it's important no matter what the school does, and you don't need to get a private evaluation necessarily, but at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you understand your child and that your child feels understood and that your child has language to talk about what's going on with him or her. And so go back to that term differential diagnosis, which is to say, we don't want to just say we have a reading problem, but we want to understand what part of reading is causing the problem and what's the school doing about it. so that we're focusing on that. Getting to that root cause is important. Making sure that we understand a child's strengths as well as their interests, and what we would call a neurodevelopmental profile, these listing of strengths, listing of challenges, and now we're putting in place strategies based on the profile. Mark is having difficulty sounding out words. We need to be working on strengthening the part of his mind that is used to sound out words. And in fact, in Mark's case, we know it has to do with he's struggling with phonics. He's struggling with the sounds in words, and he's struggling putting sounds and letters together. So we want to make sure that there's an evidence-based program that he's receiving in his IEP that's working on that breakdown. We also want to make sure that since Mark can understand above grade level text, that he's having access to that. Nothing more frustrating for Mark, who can understand Harry Potter, to be given a very low level book for reading pleasure when his brain wants so much more. And so what are we giving him to not just work on his challenges, but to allow him to further develop his strengths? Because Rafael Nadal would never have won Wimbledon if he just worked on his backhand. And how do we build self-awareness and self-esteem and resilience? And talking about people like Rafael Nadal or people with reading disabilities that have been incredibly successful, providing these things in perspective and ensuring that your child is having opportunities to experience success in school becomes a critical piece. Next, please. So, and wanted to leave lots of time for questions. But what are the conclusions? Well, first of all, in general, it still almost always makes sense to start with your school. They have to provide an assessment. It doesn't cost you anything. And in more times than not, it's going to be sufficient. And so there's almost, and even if you decide to have an independent evaluation, it's important for the school to be involved in the process. So I would say almost always start with your school. And if things seem to be going well, that might be all you need to do. And more often than not, that's going to be the case. Consider a private consultation, not necessarily an evaluation, but a consultation either early on to inform your interactions with your school. Now realize that there are other ways to get that information, and Understood is doing a huge service of making a lot of that information available. And so looking at Understood or other sites to help you sort of get your head wrapped around some of these issues. Later on, to look at the assessment and to look at their findings and their recommendations to see that what they're doing makes sense. When might you consider a private evaluation? Well, once again, after your school has done their evaluation, if you disagree with their findings or you're feeling that they have not gone deeply enough, and I see a lot of people who come frustrated, and it's understandable, where you're concerned about a problem that you're seeing your child taking 3 hours to do math homework or 3 hours to do reading homework when you know it's supposed to take 45 minutes. And the school does an assessment and says everything's fine. And I'm going to go back to a medical analogy and say if you go to your doctor and you say, my knee hurts and I can't walk, and they do x-rays and the x-ray's normal and they tell you everything's fine, you say, well, wait a second, I have a problem, you just haven't found it. And so, if your school's evaluation says, well, everything's fine, and you say, well, everything isn't fine, I don't think you've looked deeply enough, and I'd go back to the school first and say, I don't think you've looked deeply enough, and see, push them to look further. But at the end of the day, if they come to a conclusion that you're not comfortable with, or as an alternative at the outset, if you're concerned about your school's ability to effectively evaluate your child, or if you're concerned about it not being done in a timely enough fashion. Next, please. I think that's our last slide.
I think that might be the last slide.
So we finished ahead of time, which I think is good. I hope there are some questions.
Yeah, there's some questions that have come through, and first I just want to thank you. It's one thing that's so interesting to me is your doctor medical background. You actually managed to bridge the worlds of medicine and law, because so much of this has to do, you were just describing so much of the legal aspects of how do you get an evaluation, when is a school required to evaluate. It's just interesting, that intersection between medicine and law.
Well, for me, it's been very personal, and we have a child with complex learning problems, and so I had the opportunity to leave full-time medicine to go to an organization where I was trained by psychologists and trained by educators, and so I've had a wonderful opportunity to sort of live between those worlds and get trained in diagnostic assessments. Plus, my wife's an attorney, so she's been through the same journey, so she works with us, and so she's taught me a lot about these things. But I've learned it by having to go through it, and I think a lot of our experience has been driven by the fact that we spent a lot of days looking at each other and saying, this is really hard, and if it's this hard for us, what's it like for everybody else? And so we sort of got pulled deeper and deeper into this world, so that we've been doing this full-time for more than a decade, and have had the opportunity to work with, we've actually evaluated medical students who are having difficulty in medical school, and have done a lot of professional development with schools and helping them understand learning. So it's been an interesting journey.
Wow.
Sure.
Wow. We thank you, and we thank your wife for helping with some of the legal stuff.
Absolutely.
So I want to kick off the questions with a couple legal related ones. We got a question from an anonymous user who said, private schools don't have to provide this, correct? And I think I know the answer, but I'll wing it to you.
That's correct. Private schools, there is still a federal law called Americans with Disabilities Act, so that there are certain things that you are entitled to, but at the end of the day, private schools have discretion, and they are able to say, sorry, we don't do that. And if your child needs that, we're not the right place for them. So they can absolutely do that. A public school, and they can wash their hands and say, sorry, we're not going to give you a contract. We're going to cancel you out because your child's needs are not needs that we can meet. But you are still entitled to services from your district or the district where the school is located. Now, I have to say that in my experience, the range of services that is provided that way may not be as deep and as often through community providers. But we've worked with families where I think the mom was an incredibly effective advocate and was in a small parochial school and had the Department of Education provide a specialist to provide Orton Gillingham reading at the school. But once again, the school needs to be willing to let an outside provider come in, and so that there are ways to sort of cobble those services together. But the short answer to your question is you're right. A private school doesn't have to.
And from the angle of evaluations, it's my understanding that if you are a student attending a private school, you can write to your local public school district and request an evaluation that would be provided at no cost to you, even though you are a student attending a private school. So there's still the possibility of getting a free evaluation. And actually Understood has an article, I'm trying to remember the title of it, where if you do qualify for services, then it's a debate for a parent whether you want to continue to attend the private school where there's a certain pool of money. It's much smaller, it's limited, unlike for a public school, so that it's likely that you would get fewer services if you stayed at the private school. So it becomes a debate for the parent. But in terms of evaluations, you still might be able to get a free one.
Yeah, you have that same right to a free one. What you need to look at is, it depends on, in New York, it's the district where your private school is located. That's the zip code. In New Jersey, I think it might be the district where you live. But that's something you can find out, but you absolutely are entitled to a free assessment, with the same free assessment that anybody going to a public school has. The other thing to know is that clearly well, I'll stop. I think you hit the points.
Yeah, I was going to say another anonymous viewer pointed out that not only can private school students request an evaluation, but also homeschooled students can request an evaluation through that public school district. So
yes, that's really important. The bottom line is that you are absolutely entitled to it, no matter what. If you're extricating your child in space, your district or the district or location has a responsibility. You don't give up those rights. And then, once again, I think, the point being, now you decide, okay, and what we always say to a family, who is in a private school, I always think about going down sort of multiple parallel paths, which is to say, okay, you now have a sense of what your child needs, and step back and say, what are my options? Option one is, what would it look like? Can we create a structure of services that makes this school work for my child, and still be a child? Because you don't want your child going to school all day, working with tutors all night, and not having time to play the clarinet, which she loves to do. So, the question becomes can you put together a program in that school that's going to work for you and your child? And don't think of it in terms of, is my child good enough to stay in this school? I would say think of it as whether this school has the ability to meet your child's needs, because your child has a right to be in a school where he or she is feeling understood and feeling successful. And oftentimes, what we'll say, so you're looking at your private school. Is a different private school an option? Sometimes the public school is better than you might think. And I think it's important to walk into the schools and walk around and develop a list of options and take time to explore them. You don't need to make a decision in a hurry. You really have time to sort these things out.
I think that's a great point. We've gotten some nuts and bolts questions about the evaluation process. Before we dive into those, I just wanted to come back to one of the finer points of the laws about evaluations. You absolutely have the right to request an evaluation, whether you're a public school student, private school student, homeschool student. If you as a parent are concerned, you can always request that free evaluation. And the school has to make a decision. They can either choose to evaluate your child, or they have to explain to you why they are deciding not to, and then that can trigger some other options for you as a parent to try to get that evaluation. I just want to come back to that.
That's an important point. Absolutely.
It's one of the finer points, and it can also lead to getting a private evaluation and that whole debate. But you mentioned early on that it almost always makes sense to start by seeking a school-based evaluation, and there definitely is the possibility the school may say, no, we're not going to do this, but you still have rights as a parent, and there's still other avenues you can pursue, and those are some of those legal areas that can be very confusing, and Understood has some great articles about it. So I just wanted to a lot of law today that
yes.
Can feel overwhelming.
Building on that, I think it's also important to, and Understood will help you understand that it's also who you ask. And it, most people will say, well, we asked the classroom teacher and she said, oh, he doesn't need an assessment. But the way that you ask matters. And so oftentimes it's the special ed chair, or it could be the principal, and Understood will explain, you want to put your request in writing. And because there's a time limit within which they need to respond and within which they need to do an assessment. And if they come back to you and say no, you can still challenge that decision as well. But most people that I've encountered don't realize, and so that the teacher may say no. And with all due respect to the teacher, I'm sure that he or she is trying to do their best, but you want to put it in place officially, which means in writing, who's the right person, and if you're not sure who to ask, your guidance counselor, your school principal might point you in the right direction and say, it's got to be addressed to, Ms. Smith, who's the chairman of special ed services in our district, and you put it in writing and say that I believe my child might be eligible for services, and that language is on the Understood website.
Yes. Okay, so let's dive into some great nuts and bolts questions. First one is from Corey77, who asks, how long approximately does the evaluation process take for a high school student? And I wonder if this varies depending on, do all evaluations tend to take about the same time?
No,
or is
it really depends on in what's happening and what is being assessed. So it's really hard to answer.
So let's say a high schooler is struggling with reading. Is it 3 hours? Is it 3 days? What would be just a rough estimate?
I think that it's going to depend on, I would rather ask the question of what assessments they're going to do, because different children move through the same assessments at different rates, and so that sometimes it can be done over the course of 4 hours, 5 hours, and sometimes it's a lot more and needs to be broken down. I'll also, oftentimes the focus is on we gave this test or we gave that test, and I think that it's really going to vary, but I'm going to say that, we're talking about order of magnitude, probably around between 4 and 6 hours of assessment is going to be a good core assessment.
Okay.
But it may be that there are different specialists, each of which are working with your child, and so each one may take an hour. I think thinking about somewhere between 4 and 6 hours is a good rule of thumb, but the critical piece is getting the information you need.
Okay. Now we were just talking about a high schooler. This next question is from R.S. Winkler, who says, I work with a kindergartner who has yet to know any letters but those in her name. She can't pull apart words or rhyme. Does this seem like this might be signs of dyslexia? Should this child be evaluated?
I think that's a hugely important question, and I think that the answer is that I'd be concerned, obviously. I think that one of the tricky parts these days is that there is a wide range of normal variation in these skills, and we're expecting children to learn things at an earlier age, even though brains don't suddenly decide to develop more rapidly because we decided kindergartners are supposed to read. So that I think that there are children who are struggling with these skills that still may be in the range of normal. I also would say that there's a range between, the way I like to think about things is to say that some kids, if you think about it almost like some things are on autopilot and some things are on manual, that there are some kids that may not have a reading disorder, but they need to be taught phonics explicitly, and that the way that they need to learn it may not be happening in that classroom. My advice would be to say, yes, I would pay attention to this child because you want to intervene early. Now, what you should know is IDEA also calls for something that's called response to intervention, which means to say that there's no reason why the school couldn't begin to put in place some early interventions. And so quite often the way to begin is to raise it with the teacher and say, look, I'm concerned about this. What's available? And oftentimes in kindergarten, particularly since the assessments that most schools do are not going to be fine-tuned enough to pick up these differences, because the truth is that the expectations of standard tests at the level of kindergarten may not pick up a real serious reading problem. So you may not necessarily want to have the school assess the child. Quite often, they will start to do interventions early on. And I would advise seeking some kind of support to provide interventions and then start to see if you're seeing improvement.
Okay. Let me ask a question that picks up on R.S. Winkler was pointing out that this kindergarten was having trouble doing things like rhyming, splitting words apart, some of these things that get at phonological awareness. And you were mentioning with Mark that your evaluation of Mark determined that he was having an issue with phonics. I was wondering if we could flip to slide number 5. If you could help us understand how the evaluation process helped you look at those words, how he was misspelling them, or maybe what types of tests might be, is asking kids to write down words, and asking kids to read aloud words, like some of the ways
So number one is that a big part of diagnostics would be something that we would call error analysis, and that and I think that as a parent or as an educator, there's a lot that a lot of interesting stuff happens that have nothing to do with tests. And so, if you wouldn't mind, go to the slide before this as well. So, what we're looking for is what we like to call the search for recurring themes. What is showing up in Mark's work that's a pattern that's consistent? And just describing what I see and saying, well, if you write RANDING to represent the word writing, I'm getting a clue that this child doesn't understand how sounds and letters work, because he's got the wrong letters to represent the sounds he's trying to represent. So that's his writing. Now let's look at spelling. The next slide, please. And so this is pretty consistent, is that he's putting letters so that we know writing has an I sound, and he has an O there. So he is saying to us in that pattern that I'm suspicious that there's a problem with his phonological processing, with his phonics. Now, what would we do in terms of an assessment? There are specific tests that look at what we call kids' ability to. There's a test that's called CTOP, for example. That's the comprehensive test of phonological processing. That is looking specifically, but a lot of and that's not. There are a whole bunch of different tools that schools use that are called learning readiness skills that are working on rhyming tasks. Can the child, say writing and take the first sound off and turn it into sliding? So can children, there are tasks or assessment tools that just look at those areas. Reading things, you'll hear the term nonsense words, which are just combinations of letters that don't mean anything, that you need to read, which taps into, well, you can't, like if I was looking at the word, HARS on this page, it's not a word. So I need to, in order to read that, I need to know my phonics. And so that and you don't need to know the names of the tests, but what you want to know is, well, what did they do to look at his phonics? I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. I think, part of the evaluation for, let's say, probably not a kindergarten, that seems a little young, but let's say a third grader, might be showing the child a word like horse, seeing if that child can read aloud the word horse. And if the child really struggles, that tells you something about the child's ability to decode or sound out words. And you were also to recognize sight words. And you were also mentioning these nonsense words. Like the child might be shown a word like jing or something that's not actually a word. But
well, I'd be careful because, recognizing a sight word is different. So what you want, in Mark's case, he would have difficulty sounding out a word he's not seen before. So, if you show him the word the, and so you may miss this, especially if he's got a good memory and is able to recognize a lot of words, but he doesn't know how to sound out words he hasn't seen before. But what I think, to sort of drill down past that is that as clinicians, we tend to throw jargon around. We tend to say names of tests that you don't understand, and so they may say we did a whisker. And I think that what you want to understand is, well, what did that test consist of? What did you do with him? Just describe to me what you saw. And I think that that's important for the assessors or the evaluators or the clinicians to sit down and tell you, okay, not just what score did he get, but what did the child do, and what did it measure? We believe, when we do an assessment, parents observe the whole assessment. So, it's important to know what did they see. And if you can't observe the assessment, you can at least ask the clinician to say to you, okay, well, what did you do to look at his phonics? How did you know it's not a problem? And ask what the test tested. Don't be afraid to feel like you ask all the questions you need to ask, and have the test explained to you in a way that you can understand it in plain language. Okay, what did my child do? How did that, and it should make sense to you to say, okay, now I understand, because, okay, that kind of got at what I'm seeing every day. But if they didn't test what you're seeing every day, or look for what you're seeing every day, you'll only find what you look for. And so I think that you want to make sure that they look for the things that you're concerned about.
Those are great points, and that's particularly great advice about keep asking until you understand what the results are. We have a follow-up question from Corey77, who says, is there something specific I need to request for reading assessments that is likely not dyslexia? My son seems to fit the example profile you used in that his thinking and recall is profound, but reading is slow and speeding up reading leads to little recall.
I think that you want to make sure, first of all, if the evaluation comes up with a credible explanation that makes sense to you, my advice to parents is to trust your gut. You know your child better than anybody. So if there's a credible explanation and it makes sense to you, then I think that's probably going to be okay. But I would push to make sure that two people that I would ask for to assess your child in the situation that you're describing is to make sure that your child was seen by a speech and language specialist and an actual reading specialist. And a reading specialist, and to find out if they sat down and read with your child, and that they were doing a genuine reading task, and watching how your child reads, and how and describe what you're seeing at home that you're concerned about. That you're seeing this, because what we always say is a good clinician is better than the test, and that a good experienced reading specialist is reading with your child and describing to you what they see, and then the description should make sense to you. And then the other piece of it, of course, is to say, whatever the outcome of the assessment is, there's two questions that you can always ask. Number one is, okay, so how are we going to tell that he or she's getting better? And when are we going to check in again? And the school's required to come back every year or every 3 years, but you can request that they come back sooner. And so that I never leave an IEP room without saying, okay, so how are we going to know whether this is working or not? Because no matter how good the assessment is, the critical piece is follow-up. Did the assessment lead to a credible explanation? Did what they come up with, okay, now we said what we think is going on, we said this is what we're going to do, are things getting better? That's really all you care about, right? Is the problem getting better? And so let's make sure that we're going to check in, okay, so when are we going to see again? When can I start to expect some progress? And how are we going to know it's being made? And don't forget to ask that question, because that is also another option to say, well, wait a second, how do I know whether the IEP is sufficient? Do I need to run to a private evaluator every time? No. Remember, it's not an emergency. These things develop over time. So you can almost always say, okay, if what they say seems credible and reasonable, okay, let's put it into place, but I want to know that it's working. And so when are we going to meet again to see that it's working? And that will give you a lot of comfort.
That's great. You've been so terrific today, and we're almost out of time. I have one more question. I'm going to combine two of them. We've actually got a couple questions that involve twice exceptional students that are gifted but are also struggling with learning and attention issues, and the issue of how do you get a child who's gifted to qualify for tests or convince the school to do that. And the specific question I'm going to throw at you is there's an anonymous parent who talks about my son is 13, he has an IEP for autism, other learning impairment, and speech and language. He also has an IQ of 143, but he's having extreme difficulties in language arts with reading, constantly erasing, and he scored high on the dyslexia symptom checkers, but the school says they're not seeing any signs. How do it sounds like this child is doing well enough in reading that, is probably very smart and compensating enough. How does this parent get this child evaluated for dyslexia?
I think it's important to know, just a couple of things, which is, to your point, is kids that are really bright can compensate for significant disabilities, and you are entitled to services, and those are situations where I definitely would push, try to find an ally at the school to see if you can get somebody to move on this. Describe what you're seeing at home, because quite often the first thing that happens is that your child is getting straight A's, but he's taking 6 hours to get an hour of homework done. And so describe what you're seeing at home, because you're right, the standard is really that a disability is a disability, and that it's getting in the way of his performance, even if he's working twice as hard. So I think that might be a situation where you push. Try to find somebody at school who will understand. Describe what you're seeing at home. Describe your concerns. But if the school is not acting, the question is whether you can push them to act, or whether that's a situation where you say we need an independent evaluation, because the school is looking too superficially at these problems and not digging down, to the bottom of this. And we see this a lot. We work with a lot of medical students, and so you can be performing at a really high level and still have a disability and need extended time for testing or what have you. So stick with your sense that your child needs help, and keep pushing.
Dr. Yellin, thank you so much for your time today. You've been really terrific, and I want to let all of the viewers know that this webinar is going to be archived. It will be available the next day or so on our site, and it'll be there forevermore. I want to let folks know that if you want to keep talking about evaluations with other parents, a lot of parents have great advice to share. You can ask a question. Understood's community section is a great place to continue this conversation. And also, we have expert chats every day. So please check our u.org/calendar to see what's coming next. And thank you all for your time today. We hope to see you again very soon. Thank you, Dr. Yellin.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day.